Good morning, it's somewhere, and welcome back to the Concellation 2021 Green Room. It's hard to be bored when you take gaming this seriously. Joining us are Ryan Courtney and Emerson Matsuuchi.
Hey guys, welcome aboard.
Thanks for having us.
This is lucky number 14 in the interview series, and it's been something to do during the pandemic. And so I'm going to start by asking you guys, how are you coping with the lack of conventions?
I don't get to have Ryan join me on those 10 to 12-hour car rides to Gen Con and Origins, so I do miss that.
Yeah, we used to go out to Origins, and I think we also went out to Gen Con too together as well. Yeah. So yeah, we've gone on some quite long car rides out to some of those conventions before.
Yeah. And I do appreciate that Ryan does a really good job of keeping me engaged in a conversation all the way to our destination.
Yeah, I haven't fallen asleep too many times in the car ride. Yeah. A few times on the way back, I think. As far as how does it affect us as designers, I don't know that I do that much that's that important other than going and doing pitches. So it's not like I'm really out there selling the games too much at conventions. I do, of course, try to interact with as many people as I can if they want to. But besides that, I mostly go to conventions to do pitches.
Yeah, it's hard to say how the pandemic has impacted because a lot of the things isn't quite tangible. So I don't know if it's affected the sales of the games and so forth. I get in touch with some of the publishers, and we still have like an ongoing relationship. So the fact that we don't have the conventions to interact face to face does make it a little bit more challenging to be able to pitch games, to show them ideas, because we don't have like physical components, physical prototypes that we can show. But we still, at least I've still been able to do a lot of communication with them. I think the biggest hurdle for me was that I don't have access to my playtest group, the usual playtest group. So designing has been a little bit more difficult in that respect. But that's not really
Ryan,
due to
you've been doing your playtests. I know you've been doing your playtest with Tabletop Simulator.
Right, I have an online playtest group, but I also have lost my playtest group here, right? The group that you and I are a part of. That's only 5 minutes down the road. That was invaluable. So that is a thing that I will, that I'm dearly missing for sure. So online's good, but that local one 5 minutes away was very, very good.
Yeah.
So I've heard each of your stories separately about how you got into designing games, but it might be fun for the audience to hear them. You guys want to talk a little bit about your entry points into this industry?
I'll let Ryan go first.
Sure. So I used to play just the typical games like your Monopolies and Scrabble and things like that. And then I actually played Scrabble quite a bit with my mother and when I was in undergrad. And then that was pretty much all the gaming I was doing at that point. And then into graduate school, I was very poor and I needed a cheap way to entertain myself. And so I went to a hobby store and bought some games. And then we just replayed the same game over and over and over again. So I know that doesn't happen much anymore with the whole cult of the new type thing. But yeah, I mean, we had only 2 or 3 games and we probably played each of them 100 times a piece. So that's where I sort of started into the hobby game space.
And I remember the times when I was a kid and I would look at games. And nowadays it's really interesting how we view playtime on the box of a game. But I remember back then, the longer the playtime, that was a much more appealing purchase than a shorter playtime. Because I wanted something that would have me engage for a longer period of time, because it seems like back then I had heaps of spare time and just not a lot of money. So I had to purchase one that I felt like would go the longest. So it's really interesting how the board games have kind of evolved. And I had a sort of a similar background to Ryan, that I was I played a lot of the older board games, and I fell in love with those. And because of lack of money too, is that we would sometimes just make our own games. So I love robots and things like that. So I first started designing by just like making robot themed games. So that's where I started.
When you were talking about playtime, I saw a post recently that I thought was brilliant. They said that the thing they need to add to the box is relationship damage potential.
No one talks during any of my games, so I don't think anything's ruined during mine. So I think mine are safe.
Yeah. But there are certain people who play more cutthroat and people who play more friendly.
Yeah.
When you guys do your design work, do you really think about that level of interaction as to whether you're building, quote unquote, a nice game or you're building a cutthroat game?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the considerations. The interactivity, so on one hand, you have something that's incredibly interactive, where you're impacting the board state of another player's board or their conditions. And then on the other end, you have this multiplayer solitaire. And this is one area where I do have some strong opinions on. I feel like that's a metric. So it's a metric on one scale, and people have different preferences for that. So oftentimes we see online posted that, oh, this game is multiplayer solitaire, as if that is a derogatory statement, that it's a flaw in the game design. But I don't particularly see it that way. I see it as a gauge, because what Roll and Writes has really shown us is that there is a strong audience for multiplayer solitaire games that you can play with other players where you don't have impact on other players' actions, but players do like to be able to see their score in relation to everyone else. And I think there is a market for that. So that's not multiplayer solitaire isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is targeting. It's one factor in how you target a particular audience. And the same goes for highly interactive games like Munchkin, for instance. So so it is something that we definitely keep in mind as we design. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak for Ryan, but I feel like we've play tested with each other and shared a lot of these like thought experiments to the point where I feel like I can kind of think like him sometimes. So, but yeah, it's something that I take into consideration, and it's always based on the audience that I'm targeting. So when I design a game, I have a particular, like a gamer profile, so to speak. Like, okay, this is the type of person I am making this game for. How much interactivity do they crave in this type of a game? So it's definitely a design consideration.
Right. I agree fully. I also pick a target audience, and I make a persona for that audience. So I make up some fictional character, and I design towards that person. And sometimes that person falls on the spectrum of wanting something to be feisty, and other times that person would prefer just to work on their own puzzle. So yeah, absolutely, it's something I think about. And I know with my puzzly games, people would probably tend to, until they're very experienced, probably tend to think that they're more solitaire. And then I have the newest game coming out is definitely interactive. As a matter of fact, it's pretty mean. So yeah, I don't necessarily even design for myself. I pick a target and I shoot for that target.
Which leads to an interesting question. Forgetting what kind of games and styles you design, what kind of games and styles do you play?
Oh, so I'm fairly eclectic in terms of the games that I like to play. So I do enjoy lots of family games, especially recently, because I do play games with my family. So I've definitely been focused, especially a lot of my purchasing, on very kid-friendly, family-weight games. But I love my party games. I love my Ameritrash games. I do like heavy Euros, although I'm incredibly picky about my heavy Euros. But I do run the spectrum, so I have all kinds of games.
So for me, there's a difference between games I like to play and games that I play because I feel like I need to. And so I do try to play a very large spectrum of games just so that I sort of keep up with what's going on with the industry and sort of what mechanisms people are working with and what's popular, things like that. As far as my sort of consumer taste, I'm incredibly picky, which is why I never give my opinion, like publicly give opinions of games. So I tend to like heavier Euro style games and word games. Those are the two style of games that I tend to like the most. Usually the more thinky it is, the more analytical it is, the more I'm going to like it.
Yeah. And it also reflects in Ryan's design work too, in that I think a lot of times his what he considers a light, so one of his prototypes he considers light, I would sit there for like 20 minutes on my turn trying to think of the right word in his word game. So he tends to really steer towards the very cognitive games, which I know that there's a strong audience for.
Small, but yeah, the people who want it. So that works out.
So when you guys started doing games, was there like a moment or a set of moments that made you feel like you went from, yeah, I'm making some rules, to, yes, I'm really a game designer, that this is much more coherent, that it's much more professional? Was there any like transition set for you?
I hardly consider myself professional. So I don't know. I'll let you know whenever I get there. But you know, the more that get published, the more I start feeling like I'm getting closer. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know that even just getting one published makes me feel like I'm professional. I still feel like I have a lot to learn, and you know, trying to make sure that I am hitting that target consistently, you know, that target audience consistently is, you know, something that, you know, that keeps game design fun for me. So that's a challenge, you know, to try to hit that target and to be as close as possible and to sort of catch those things before it releases and know that I'm, you know, at least within an area of where I think that I'm making it. So I think if I can get to a point where I do that consistently, then I would start to feel like I was professional. Right now, I don't feel professional yet.
Game design is one area that it's not really well defined, like what marks the point at which you become a game designer. So my personal path towards it was, I started off as, you know, I was doing software development, and I switched from being a full-time software developer to doing more contract consulting basis. And so, and I transitioned at a pretty bad time, in that a lot of things were starting to get outsourced. So a lot of development houses started to move offshore. And so my partner and I, we were trying to compete in a market that was slowly moving away. And a lot of it was being outsourced. So I noticed that there was going to be more gaps between the projects, and we were having a harder time finding projects, and then the gaps started to grow in between them. And so I decided that, well, let me do something that I enjoy doing in those gaps. So I was doing game design. So I wanted to design games or do something within that space. So publish games, design games, what have you. And those gaps started to grow bigger and bigger. And so I spent more and more time doing game design. But now it's been quite a while since I've had a contract, but there was never a time when I said, I am no longer a software developer and I'm now a game designer. It was such a gradual shift, so that I don't know where within that spectrum I made that transition. So it's still kind of nebulous to me. And like Ryan said, it's like how it's hard to say that you are a game designer. A lot of times, you know, in our fields, we have like certifications, or we have to pass some kind of a bar exam or something to that effect. There's no equivalent for a game designer. So it's almost like it's a self-branded thing. And when you become a game designer is when you start calling yourself one. So, and if that's the case, it's only been recently that I started calling myself a game designer.
So what kind of software work were you doing?
I did a lot of enterprise-wide architecture software. So I was actually quite eclectic in my development as well. So we did a lot of user interface, UX type of stuff. We did a lot of back end. I did a lot of work in middleware, where we had messaging transformation systems to be able to have all these disparate systems within a company communicate with each other. So we had all different kinds of messaging networks, and also we had to integrate into like some legacy mainframe style systems. So, and because of that, we worked with lots of different technologies, and so my expertise is kind of spread out into like different areas as well.
Very cool. And I know, Emerson, you wanted to ask Ryan that same question about his expertise and profession.
Oh yes, yes. So Ryan, how do you actually? I guess the question I want to ask is like, I know that you've been doing a lot of work in the space of like machine learning. Is there anything that you you can leverage from your expertise in that area to apply to game design?
So in theory, yes, but I think that the amount of time and resources that would have to go into building out those types of models doesn't make sense, at least for where I am in the board game world. I'm not selling enough units for that to make a ton of sense. But I do use principles from ML in game designs. So like I'll use an idea. So for instance, in one of my games, I'm sort of leaning on this reinforcement learning principle of exploration versus exploitation, which is sort of the difference between when do you spend resources to explore more of the world to better understand the world versus when do you use the resources to start exploiting what you know about the world already, you know. And so in the game, it's the difference between learning more about the hidden space or working on getting points from what you know about the space currently. So more of using it as a design thing and less using it as sort of like a development tool for me at this point. I've used it a little bit when I was working on apps, just because I would need to auto generate puzzles and auto solve puzzles so that you know, I could have essentially infinite of them, so they would never run out. But with board games, I haven't really had that, and I guess that wasn't even really ML. That was just basic
algorithms.
Yeah. So not too much ML. Mm-mm.
Yeah. Do you ever like write programs to simulate your games and just brute force test your games that way?
Not the board games. No. So I'll do the math, like to make sure that I know, you know, the basic combinations or permutations of things, and I'll write mathematical formulas for things. But yeah, I haven't really had to write any software for the board games and or make like a brute force AI. I did finally try to make a solo game, so I have made a board game equivalent of AI or whatever, which really shouldn't be called AI. I don't know why it's called that in board games, but it's weird calling, you know, when I'm talking about that type of stuff, it's weird talking about that as being AI when, you know, the other work that I'm doing is just two different domains talking about or using the same word. They're overloading that word.
Right.
They're definitely not very similar.
Yeah, I think that the terms AI and also like programming games, they're kind of misnomers from our perspective, because we have technical backgrounds.
Right. So, yeah. Programming games. I did pitch a programming game one time, and I was like, no, it's really a programming game.
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, no, we've played programming games before, and I was like, all right, this is going to be a disaster. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually tempted to just make a game about programming, just to illustrate that this is different than what most people's notion of a programming board game is. So, but I do have to say, I think there was one that was similar or was going down the right path. It was Twin Tin Bots, where you gave it commands and the commands would stay. so that you were just iterating on the command. So that was probably the closest representation of programming, as opposed to sort of just the programming that we see in, or the games that are classified as programming games. So
Right.
one interesting thing that, and sorry, I don't mean to like
No, please do.
commandeer the podcast, but
All yours.
one interesting thing that I notice is that I don't go through the whole process, but sometimes what I like to do is pretend like I am writing the AI for an opponent for a game. And sometimes that starts to reflect, okay, by building this, you're starting to see the depth of the gameplay itself. So the more complex the AI needs to be a competent opponent, seems to have a correlation with the depth of the game. So in a way, you're kind of making like a heuristics tree of how this algorithm is going to perform. So sometimes I just like to think about, okay, what if I were to just make an AI for this game? How would it react? What are the decision branches that it needs in order to function properly? And so Ryan is probably, out of all the designers, he's the one I think most likely would kind of go through the same kind of like mental exercises. So especially because of like the machine learning work that you do.
I think I'm just obsessive. My mind just never shuts off. That I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but yeah, I will say that playtesting ends up being the most important thing for me by far. So no tool that I do, or any math formula that I write up or anything like that compares to what playtesting does. Mostly because for the most part, they work-ish, like mechanically they work and mathematically they work. The question is does anybody want to actually play them? So that ends up being the main thing. Is like, okay, I can get this system doing system things, right? But does anybody actually want to play with this system or not?
Right.
So yeah, playtesting for me has been pretty much everything. And yeah, I run everything through my head constantly. So I think Emerson and I do a lot of things similar, even though we don't necessarily make the most similar of games to each other. We have a similar process on a lot of these aspects.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we approach it very similarly. So, and I think that I also have the same feeling about playtesting, in that I've brought games that especially now, I have a lot more time to just sit in my own little vacuum and design and work out all the math behind it to make sure that it's well balanced and the math model works. But then it's always that moment of truth when you actually bring it in front of players. You have to go with their feelings, their emotions, and how they're reacting to the system that you brought into that. Do they look like they're enjoying the process of exploring that system, or is it just just an unenjoyable experience? So one example, I actually made a math game. It might have been inspired by one of Ryan's math games that he brought, the speed one. So I think my response to that was one that wasn't based on speed. So I had designed the game that allows you to manipulate numbers to be able to match codes. And so I worked out everything, mathematically everything should work. There was enough variability so people can take opportunities of imbalances and so forth. And I brought it to playtesters, and the consensus was that it's a game. It wasn't a very fun one, but it was a game. So that's why playtesters are just invaluable to us, is because sometimes we see the model, we see the math, but we can't see if it's fun or not.
Well,
Yeah,
I suspect the way they walk through holes is interesting also. Things that you thought were solid in the rules.
Yeah, not so much that we find that they break the game. I mean, that certainly happens sometimes when we realize that we've made an error somewhere in our model. But most of the time, it's really just whether they're enjoying the process or not, or a good indicator is if they start to come up with their own end game conditions, because the end game conditions that you gave just aren't fun. So if the end game goal was to get to a certain number of victory points, but players are just growing their armies larger and larger and larger and amassing more and more resources, and not actually doing what the game is incentivizing them to do, it's an indicator to us that we probably picked the wrong end game condition.
Right. That definitely happens in playtesting quite a bit, especially when you're in playtest groups where you play tons and tons of games. Sometimes you're like, yeah, I know you told me I'm supposed to do this thing, but this thing's more fun. So
right, exactly.
It's like, I'm going to try to be professional here and play the game you want me to play, but I kind of want you to make this game different. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes I will say if you are a newer designer, that is a major trap, is to just listen sort of exclusively to what other people say. That is one thing you do need to learn is that you need to be able to take feedback and then ignore it sometimes. We've had some folks in our groups that literally just swung back and forth like a pendulum, because they would test their game and then somebody would say something, they would adjust it, and then the next time they come in, it was get tested again. So someone would say something like essentially the opposite. They'd adjust it back and forth, and like the person started getting very frustrated because they're like, I'm listening to what you're saying, but like each time it's just like swinging back and forth, and he essentially didn't get anywhere and had a bunch of frustration. So while feedback is very important, you also do need to sort of know, and this is why that target audience is so important, right? So you can sort of narrow in on who you think you want it for, instead of just sort of swinging back and forth.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I always make a point that when I play test a designer's game, I always ask them before I give any feedback, is that what is their design goal? What was their target audience? What is it that they want to do with the game? So an example is that someone brought like a very Munchkin-esque kind of game with a whole lot of take that in there. And it just wasn't my cup of tea. And I wasn't going to tell them, well, no, you got to take that mechanisms out, put more resource management and put victory point. I wasn't about to do that until I understood what their design goal was. And when I asked them, they said, well, they wanted to make a Munchkin game with this particular theme. And in that respect, I think that they did a good job because they knew their audience. This is the type of game that they're going to like. And so I'm trying to tailor my feedback to what they're trying to achieve with that design. And I find often that when designers get feedback, it's not always through the proper lens. So I think it's always important especially like Ryan said, it's really, really good advice that if you're a new designer, you do need to understand how to filter the feedback that you receive, and always have in your mind, just keep your vision in mind as to what you want this game to accomplish. Like, what's the audience that you want for this game?
Yeah, I try to warn people. Sorry.
Yeah.
I try to warn people. I say, I kind of like this game. That might be a problem, So if I personally like it, then your game's probably not going to sell very well. And so like, I'll try to tell people, I'll be like, okay, you're kind of designing this in a way that I might like, you might want to change that a little bit, So for me, I actually sort of try to go the opposite when I'm giving my feedback, and that I'm like, okay, I understand what you're doing. It's very puzzly or it's very thinky. You might need to tone this down a little bit. I have to do the same thing with my games as well, right? It's so like, the more fascinating it gets for me, the less chance that it has of getting picked up by a publisher is pretty much how it works.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate, because I think my favorite Ryan game was actually by far the simplest one.
I'm trying to make simpler ones. I'm working. They're very, very difficult for me. I have a huge amount of respect for people who make simple, elegant games and lighter games. If I could do them well, I would, and I'm trying. It's a skill that I'm trying to. That goes back to the being a professional type thing, right? Mm. Like, this is a thing that I should be able to do, and I feel like I'm getting better at it. But I find making heavier games just simply simpler. Like, it is much simpler for me to design in that space. And I don't know how people do the lighter games, but it's impressive, and I wish I could. I wish I could make a Wingspan, or I guess I shouldn't name games because then I'm going to get in trouble for saying something's light.
Light on the Ryan scale.
Yeah. So yeah, I wish I'm more impressed by people who make those games than I am people who make heavy games. In heavy games, there's less competition. They can be a little rough around the edges. People are a little bit more tolerant, right? They're willing to spend 30 minutes reading your rule book and then watching a video after that to make sure that they got the rules right. Like, you don't get away with that, with the lighter games. And you have an audience who doesn't necessarily game all the time. You could have someone who's just going into Target and picking up a game and trying to play it with their kids. Like, to make a game that works for family weight and is simple and yet still is engaging is very impressive to me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ryan in that the simpler games, you simply have a smaller area of design space, right? So you only can work with a few mechanisms. You don't want it to be overbearing. And oftentimes it's really hard to come up with something engaging and innovative in that space. Like, you really do need to come up with a whole new category of mechanism in order to like really break into that segment of the market to really stand out. And oftentimes the games that try to like the really light games tend to be quite derivative. And I'm not saying that derogatorily. It's just sort of like a matter of fact that because there's only so many combinations of these mechanisms that you can put together. So with a smaller subset, you're going to get fewer combinations. Versus with a heavier game, you have more mechanisms that you can put in. So if you can make a combination, if you can add 12 elements to your combination, you're going to have a much more unique set of stuff. And the challenge really there is to be able to manage that system. So, and I think people with and I'm generalizing, I'm super generalizing, but I think people who have a technical background tend to have an easier time with managing those systems. And the more complicated the systems, so like Ryan is incredibly talented when it comes to doing things like this, to take these very complicated systems and be able to manage them, balance them, and hopefully make them fun, which is always the biggest challenge.
So one of the first things that Ryan ever said to me about game design is, if you ever show a game to a publisher, assume they're going to want to retheme it. So I'm going to ask you guys the question: if there's people out there who are starting out in game design or feeling a little dead-ended in game design, are there a couple of pieces of advice you'd put in front of them, a couple of good guidelines or things to think about?
Oh. In terms of, is it just specifically about the theme?
No, about the whole idea of how they could be better at game design, the things you might recommend that they look at, or games they should play first, or any of those things.
Well, my biggest advice to designers is to do your research on the publishers themselves, to know like what kind of themes appeal to them, what type of products that they're trying to create, and what's the audience, and whether the design that you have really fits into their product line. So, and it's going to take a lot of very objective introspection on your design to know whether it's a good fit for a publisher, if it's right, or if it's not so much just a matter of retheming something, but obviously mechanisms sometimes are tied to the theme. So just changing the theme would also some designs are just going to be better served by changing some of the mechanisms with a new theme. So you just really need to understand the publishers the same way that publishers need to understand the customers in order to be able to sell them a product.
So for me, I typically ask people or tell people to sort of formulate what their goal is, because for a lot of people, that's a different thing. For some people, it's just simply getting your game published. For some people, it's making a Kickstarter and selling a couple hundred games. So if you are doing it as a piece of art or as a personal project, something like that, you could sort of do whatever theme that you want. There will be, a few hundred people or 1,000 people on Kickstarter who will probably be excited about whatever theme you pick. If you are trying to go for a publisher, then like Emerson said, you need to research and see what is in their library or portfolio and match with that. And then the other thing that I try to sort of hammer in for newer designers is what I call a 1 week rule. And that is that 1 week after I've started putting in work onto a game, I get it in front of playtesters. And so the reason for this is that if you don't get your game in front of playtesters, you start getting attached to it, and you will start defending your game and during playtesting, which is one of the worst things you can possibly do. And then once you get attached, you can't make changes, or you sort of get into that sunk cost fallacy type situation where all of a sudden, you've been working on this, like saying that you've been working on a game for 7 years, that's from like a more professional standpoint, that's not a selling point, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's a red flag.
Right. So if it's a personal project, again, like if it's a personal thing that you're just having fun doing, then, do whatever you need to do. But if you think that you want to get into sort of a more professional space, or, pitch to publishers, I think if you've been saying, like, I've been working on this for 7 years, I know it all works perfectly. Those are like things that I hear. I'm like, ooh, that's not what I want to hear. Like any designer period who says that everything that they made is working perfectly, or there's no flaws, or they've got it all smoothed out, I'm like, oh, something's wrong here. Something's very wrong, because all games have flaws and trade-offs. Like that is a lot of what game design is. It's just figuring out, what trade-offs am I going to make in this game, right? You can't have everything, and everything, things fall on all different types of spectrums. Like we were talking about the interaction versus games that aren't interactive. Like you're always making decisions on trade-offs. So yeah, 1 week rule, and then also just know what your personal goals are for your game.
Very cool. So we're almost to the end of the time. I want to give you guys a chance to quickly pitch. What do you guys have coming out? What have you guys just put out? What would you like to tell people about real quick? Ryan, you want to start?
Sure. So my newest game is a stock game, and thankfully for the news with the Wall Street bets and whatnot, they're doing a little bit of promotion for me with that stuff. So it's about market manipulation. You're not necessarily the best of folks in the game. So you manipulate prices, try to make money. So that's my newest one. It's very different from my other puzzle games. And I'll continue
When's it coming out?
That I don't know that I can say yet. Soon.
Very cool. Emerson?
Yeah. Before I get into my stuff, I just wanted to mention that I did. If that's the same stock market game that I played, the one that that I really enjoyed, is that the same one?
Yeah, same one.
Do they make a lot of changes to it? Or is it? Okay.
Very cool.
Yeah, that was a really good one. For me, I think the only thing that's really coming out that I can announce for sure is just Foundations of Rome, which was I think initially it was supposed to be delivered in January, but because of the situation, I think now it's shooting for July, I believe. So, but don't quote me on that, because it's a moving target at the moment. And I do have a couple of other projects with Plan B and Arcane Wonders that it's still too early to announce, but I do have some projects coming down the pipeline.
Very, very cool. Danny!
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.